With every single NHL draft, it feels like we always see one massive surprise that shocks the hockey world. And today I want to go through a bunch of reaches in modern NHL history that actually ended up working out, filling up their potential and proving everybody wrong. So which NHL draft reaches actually worked out and became superstars in the league, and which one do I think was the biggest reach that actually ended up working out? Well, make sure you guys watch till the end as we go through every player's story to see which ones are the most impressive and which players shocked us the most. So make sure you watch till the end for all that, and hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey breakdowns and content just like this all throughout the offseason. Now we're going to go through the oldest drafts in recent memory to the newest, and let's start out with the 2003 NHL draft, which had a big surprise at 20th overall when the Minnesota Wild ended up selecting Brent Burns. Now Burns has always been a fascinating player and character in a lot of ways, but his draft story is just so interesting to me because he originally played defense growing up, then switched to a wing, and eventually got drafted by the Wild at 20th overall. But as you can see, as a right winger, his production wasn't that fantastic in the OHL. 40 points, 68 games. He did play pretty well in the playoffs that year, getting a point per game for Brampton, but nothing all too special, especially to be a top 20 pick. And on Brampton in his draft year, he was just 10th in scoring on his team, which for a wing especially isn't all that impressive, but he was just transitioning into a new position, of course had the size and the potential that Minnesota could see, and once he got into that Minnesota system, he would eventually transition as a defenseman, which seems to have worked out for him. It's very rare nowadays to see a player, especially heading into their draft year, still trying to figure out their position long term, but Brent Burns has always been a bit of an enigma, and at 20th overall, even though he was a bit of a reach at the time, he was a fantastic selection and easily one of the best players in a loaded 2003 draft. Now let's move on to the very next draft in 2004 and go from a 20th overall pick to a top 5-1, where the Arizona Coyotes shocked the world by selecting Blake Wheeler. Going back to his draft year, he was a bit of an unknown commodity, playing in the Minnesota High School League, which is always a bit of an unpredictable one, playing against high school competition. He was absolutely insane, getting 89 points and 39 goals in 27 games. But Wheeler was somebody that was projected more as a second rounder. Even heading into the draft, there was a lot of speculation about where he could end up going, and Arizona selecting him at 5th overall was a massive surprise. I mean, even though he was a dominant high school players rarely even get into the first round. You have to be a special player to even get into the 20s as a high school player, but to see Wheeler as a top 5 pick, especially back then in 2004, was unprecedented. It's interesting too because Wheeler was also a bit of a slow burner, somebody that in the USHL didn't light things up immediately, and for the University of Minnesota, a solid scorer, but not an elite one yet. But he would continue to get better in the University of Minnesota, and after college, unfortunately would end up signing with the Arizona Coyotes, which made that 5th overall selection even stranger for them, but would go on to the Boston Bruins and would immediately start his NHL career pretty solidly, getting 45 points in 81 games. And of course, the rest is history, being a solid part of the Thrashers and the Winnipeg Jets, and finishing his career off with the New York Rangers, but especially in his best moments. I mean, the offensive potential was always there to see, but especially as a 5th overall pick, it was a big surprise that turned out very good. Just not very good for the Coyotes. Moving on to the 2011 NHL Draft, another major surprise inside the top 10, we go on to Mark Scheifele being the first ever draft pick by the Winnipeg Jets. Of course, we know Scheifele now is one of the best players from that 2011 draft and somebody that has led by example in a lot of ways, being one of the top scorers offensively in the NHL these last few years. But in a lot of ways, Scheifele didn't really have that hype behind him heading into the draft. I even found this ranking from the Hockey News, ranking him 41st in the draft, with a lot of scouts questioning how much of a risk he might end up being, and because he was on the bad team, how much quality ice time he got. Pretty silly conversations looking back on things, because Scheifele always had the potential to match. It's interesting looking back because of the two players that went directly after Scheifele, with Sean Couturier at 8, Dougie Hamilton at 9, two guys that had so much hype coming into their draft, but I think Scheifele has really made it easy for the Jets to win that pick over for how good of a piece he's been for that team, for how important of a piece he's been for that team, especially as they've built that roster up. I think they made the right decision in the end. But it's crazy, man, especially somebody that was listed as a 2nd round pick. If he went in the 2nd round, he'd be looked at as one of the biggest draft steals of all time, but I think he went where he probably should have. Now let's move on to a curious one here in the 2013 NHL draft, and somebody that might be a bit of a loose interpretation in terms of the draft reaches out there, but I think Alexander Barkov deserves to be in this conversation because at 2nd overall, he was a bit of a surprise to go there once it was said and done. The 2013 draft, especially at the top, was strange. Even though by the the end, Nathan MacKinnon was front-running by a decent margin. There were still players like Jonathan Drouin and especially Seth Jones that had a ton of hype going into that draft. But Barkov was looked at largely as the fourth best prospect of that draft, at least for a lot of that draft year process, and really looking back on it, shouldn't have been, because the talent and potential was pretty clear to see. Now the story goes, of course, that the Avs drafted Nathan MacKinnon first overall, but with second overall in the Florida Panthers, they were debating between a few options: Seth Jones, Jonathan Drouin, and of course, Alexander Barkov. But the head European scout for the Panthers actually threatened to leave if they didn't end up selecting Alexander Barkov. That pressured the Panthers enough to end up selecting him, and I think they made the right decision when we look back at things. Really though, I don't think Barkov should have been that much of a reach, even though he was projected more in the 4 to 5 range. It seemed like there was more of a gulf between the hype of players like MacKinnon, Seth Jones, even Jonathan Drouin, and what Alexander Barkov was doing, but it really shouldn't have been the case. You look at what he was able to do in the Liga in his draft year, almost a point per game, which is just ridiculous, plus being a point per game in the playoffs. At that rate, Barkov had the stats to back it up. He had the potential. Doing what he's done has still never even come close to being replicated since then. Really, I think Barkov's been able to cement himself as the second best player in that 2013 draft, clearly ahead of Jonathan Drouin and Seth Jones. And now Seth Jones, of course, teammate of Barkov for their Stanley Cup win. But in Barkov's case, the consistency both in offense and defense, the way he's been able to lead by example for the Panthers' back-to-back Stanley Cup wins, at second overall, that's a pretty good pick to make. Now let's go into the 2017 NHL draft, and this player has been in flux a little bit over the last couple of seasons, but I still think could be a superstar again. Let's talk about Elias Pettersson and the shock that he brought when he was drafted at 5th overall. Now Pettersson is an interesting one because if you were truly paying attention to what he was able to do back in 2017, it might not have been the biggest surprise in the world. The Allsvenskan, I think, was starting to get more and more attention as a solid pro league, but it wasn't starting to get the attention that maybe it's deserved. And you see back in 2017, he was almost a point per game in a pro men's league in Sweden, which is extremely hard to do. Even players like Frindell and players like Victor Eklund have only tried to be around that range. And in Pettersson's case, playing more than 40 games too, and also being around that point per game range was extremely impressive. And that's playing in a very competent pro men's league, and in Pettersson's case, being a very slim and lanky player to do so. He was still pretty tall, but the big thing was the skill set and how he was able to use it, and just how good he was against pro competition already. Those were the big things that led to him being a fifth overall selection by the Canucks, and being a pretty big surprise, because a lot of lists, a lot of really public scouting had him more outside the top 10, maybe even top 15. He was more so in the mid-first round range though, and to see him as a 5th overall selection, especially with how many hyped players there were in 2017, was a bit of a shock. We can debate what Elias Pettersson is right now. Maybe he's not a superstar, but how he was trending, especially back in 2023, he was becoming a superstar and one of the best centers in the league. I still think there is the potential for Pettersson to be that, but especially for what he was, for how much of a reach and how much of a shock he was, he's still a massive success story, even if these struggles still continue. I mean, even if he continues to struggle like he has, he still could be around a 60-point player at his worst, which ain't too bad. Now let's go on to the 2018 NHL draft, and this one has a few very interesting stories. Not the greatest draft in the world, but because of that, there is some big draft busts, some big reaches, and some big success stories. But I want to talk about Brady Kachchuck here, who is somebody that I think was a bit of a reach at the time for a lot of people, a bit of a surprise to see go in the 4th overall selection, but has really turned out to be exactly what the Senators needed. Looking back at this draft, it is really strange. You have, of course, Darlene Svechnikov going 1st and 2nd overall. Not really much of a surprise there. But after, you have the big reach in Jesperi Kotkaniemi being drafted 3rd overall, which didn't really work out for the Montreal Canadiens. But then you had another slight reach. Not as big as Kotkaniemi, but a pretty big surprise still, having Brady Kachchuck go number 4 to Ottawa. He was much more of a 7, 8, 9 range type of player back then. Somebody that I had my concerns with when I initially started scouting. This was the first draft that I even had any experience watching players, so it was an interesting one for me, even though I wasn't that good of a scout back then. But in Kachuk's case, he was a pretty big surprise to me to go in the top 5, top 4, especially over players like Zadina. Even Quinn Hughes had a ton of hype as well coming into the draft. That was kind of the big thing though, was the Filip Zadina hype train, because not a lot of people realized just how much attention, how much hype he was getting back in his draft year because of the unbelievable World Juniors, just how good he was in the QMJHL back in his draft year. He had so much attention on him, and and he was somebody that a lot of people were potentially having in the second overall range to Carolina, maybe going to Montreal at third overall, if not potentially Arizona or Ottawa ending up getting him, but none of those teams ended up taking him, with teams like Montreal taking Kotkaniemi, teams like Ottawa taking Kachchuck, and especially the Coyotes taking Barrett Hayden at fifth overall. That's when the slide really started to feel real. But there was a lot of conversation about Kachchuck being drafted over Zadina and the Ottawa Senators potentially making a mistake back then. But I think out of the three reaches of Kotkaniemi, Kachchuck, and Hayden, Kachchuck has pretty clearly distanced himself and put himself on that bigger tier. Being the captain for the Ottawa Senators in a lot of ways really brings so much more offensive potential than I even thought he could have. Even though he took a bit of a slight step back this last year, he's still a 55-point player, and last year got 74 points. The year before that, 83 points in 82 games. When he is at his best, he is a fantastic goal scorer, and something that with the intensity that he brings is just such a valuable part of any team he's a part of. So for Ottawa especially, even though Quinn Hughes might be the better player, for Ottawa, Brady Kachchuck is what they needed and really needed a lot more of. So looking back on it, it was pretty much the perfect pick for them. And we go into the very next draft in the 2019 selections here, and this is where we go into Moritz Seider, one of the most notable draft reaches at the time that I think has really worked out for the Detroit Red Wings. Being drafted 6th overall by Detroit, and especially at the time being a massive, overwhelming surprise. This is another one that requires a lot of context because Seider, of course, looking back, would still be one of the best players in the 2019 draft, and redraft-wise might even go higher when it's all said and done. But at the time, Seider was much more of a mid, even in the 20s type of first-round pick. Personally, I think I had him 15th in my draft rankings, and I thought I was pretty high on him at the time. He was something that I liked quite a bit with the mobility and how good defensively he was, and that's kind of what we've seen him translate into at the NHL level. But still, for him to go 6th overall, especially above some of the options that he went above, was a bit of a shocker. Players like Philip Broberg, Trevor Zegras especially, even guys like Matt Boldy, Cam York, Cole Caulfield. There was a lot of guys that were projected way higher than Seider that he ended up leapfrogging, especially the defensemen, guys like Broberg, Cam York. We were kind of all expecting those two guys to go above Seider, and for Seider to be maybe the 4th, 5th defenseman taken off the board, but of course he ends up as the number 2 guy, only a couple picks behind Bowen Byram. It's interesting looking back because he was a reach for a lot of people by maybe 10, maybe even 15 picks or so. He was leapfrogging a lot of hyped players like Trevor Zegras and Cole Caulfield, but honestly, looking back on that selection, maybe he wasn't a reach enough. Maybe he should have been inside the top 4, top 3 in terms of the actual play, the potential, because he is just that good. Largely, he's been a pretty consistent player. Even though he hasn't been able to reach the point totals of his rookie season, he's always been a player leading by example on that Detroit defense, and they've really needed it. It's a defense that's been all over the place, but Seider's been able to hold his own, even with the horrible options he's mostly had to play with. I'm still a big fan of him, even though his perception maybe is a bit more inflated than maybe he is, but I still think he's a top pair defenseman, and especially as a 6th overall pick. Easily a worthwhile decision for Detroit to make, but a ballsy one, because at the time, Seider definitely did not have that type of hype behind him. Now let's move on to our last 2 draft reaches here, and both coming from the 2021 NHL draft. Let's first start out with Mason McTavish, who was a pretty similar situation, I would say, to Moritz Seider. Now, when we look at the 2021 draft, it's always going to have insane reaches, insane busts, just because this draft was so unpredictable. With the pandemic and everything, it made a ton of players have to leave the CHL, and it really made drafting and scouting Canadian players way harder than it used to be, and that has created a few really interesting selections. But let's first start out with Mason McTavish, who I think has a pretty similar situation to Kotkaniemi back in his draft year, where he was something that was kind of all over the place, had some potential, was able to show it at times, but was somebody that was more so in the 10 range, maybe even outside of it, but ended up going 3rd overall, and the Ducks, looking for a center, got their guy. McTavish was somebody that was a bit lower on in his draft year just because of the unpredictability surrounding a lot of the guys, especially as they headed over to Switzerland. He was somebody that played pretty well there, mostly had his greatest hockey though at the U18 World Juniors, where he was absolutely fantastic there. So you were able to see the talent there especially, and able to see what he was made of. I just didn't really see him being a 3rd overall pick type of player, but I think since then he's been able to show what he's made of, and getting back to some normalcy, the skill level on display. Really, I do feel bad for a lot of 2021 draftees because they had their developments really shifted in a lot of key ways. But McTavish has been able to rebound from that, even with going from all these different leagues, has been able to really cement himself as a true, I think, 2nd-line center of the future. Maybe not a number 1 guy, but still a really effective center that you want to have in your lineup. Pretty similarly, I still think, to a Sam Bennett when he does reach his prime. So even though there's maybe a couple of players you might still take ahead of him at that 3rd overall selection looking back on things, I think McTavish has still pretty cemented himself as a top player in the 2021 draft, and not really a reach by any means at 3rd overall. Considering the unpredictability of the draft, I think the Ducks did pretty well with their reach getting McTavish at 3rd overall, at least if they don't end up trading him. And then that leaves us on to the biggest surprise of the 2021 draft, at least one of the biggest ones inside the 1st round. Somebody that, especially since then, has not only been able to beat the reach allegations, but vastly surpass them, and maybe even become the best player of the 2021 draft, in Wyatt Johnston of the Dallas Stars. This one's pretty infamous for me, especially with my takes when he was drafted initially at 23rd overall. But I think Johnston was one of the players really victimized the most by the pandemic and having to play elsewhere because he didn't actually play anywhere else. Because the CHL completely went away during the season, he only played 7 U18 World Junior games, getting 4 points in 7 games. Wasn't a bad player by any means, but didn't really look like a 1st round player with just those 7 games involved. But he was a solid player for Windsor before, and somebody that was looked at mostly as a 2nd round pick, if not more of a mid to late 2nd rounder. Especially when you consider where he was ranked by a lot of public outlets. You had Craig Button at 63, you had Elite Prospects at 54, Bob McKenzie was really the highest on him at 40th overall. Personally for me, I had him 42nd in my draft rankings, so pretty high compared to a lot of the consensus when you look at it. But if I have somebody in my mid-2nd round, they're likely to project more as a bottom 6er, which is what I saw Johnston ultimately becoming. A pretty solid 3rd-line player, but definitely not what we've seen him become, because right after he was drafted, he torched the OHL, getting 124 points in 68 games, and then immediately entering the NHL and becoming one of the Stars' best players. Like I said, though, I think if Johnston were to have played the season somewhere else in Europe, or even if the OHL were to have played the full season, I think the consensus around him would have been a lot more in the 20s range. But of course, the Stars have a fantastic scouting staff, and that's why they get paid the big bucks to do this stuff. They absolutely crushed the Johnston pick, and even though it was a major surprise at the time, looking back, he's another one kind of like Seider that should have gone higher. And hey, as a Stars fan, I will take the fact that the Stars got both Johnston and Stankoven in the same draft. Funnily enough, I wanted Stankoven to actually be their pick at 23rd overall. They got him later and were able to package him for Mikko Rantanen, so I think it worked out pretty well for them in the end. But those are some NHL draft reaches that proved all of us wrong and ended up becoming great picks in the end. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you guys enjoyed, make sure that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. A big shout out to JC Hockey as well for the video idea for this one. It was a ton of fun to break down a ton of these players and see what the consensus was like for them back in their draft years. But of course, comment down below your thoughts on the players I mentioned. Were there any players that I missed, reaches that ended up working out? And if you want to watch some more videos, make sure you click on this playlist right here for all my hockey prospect talk right in one playlist there, and I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.